The glass hit the counter with enough force to make the bartender flinch, whiskey sloshing over the rim as Thomas Lawson's calloused hand trembled with barely contained fury. Through the grimy window of the Rusty Nail Saloon, the Montana sunset painted the sky blood, read a fitting backdrop for a man whose soul felt equally crimson with loss, equally empty as the bottle he'd been nursing since noon. The year was 1876, and the West had taken everything from him: his ranch, his brother, and finally, his will to continue the struggle against a merciless land that gave nothing but took all. Thomas ran a hand through his dark hair, now streaked with premature gray at 32, and signaled for another pour. "That'll be your fifth today, Lawson," the bartender, a man called Murphy, said with concern etching his weathered face. Maybe you ought to pour and mind your business," Thomas snapped, pushing his glass forward. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping under stars and too many days driving cattle through dust storms. The saloon door swung open, allowing a shaft of dying sunlight to cut across the sawdust-covered floor. Most patrons paid no mind travelers passed through Clearwater Springs frequently, especially since the railroad had come through last year. But Thomas noticed her immediately, the way a man dying of thirst notices water. She stood silhouetted in the doorway for a moment, a slender figure in a traveling dress of deep blue. As she stepped inside, her features became clearer honey-blonde hair pinned beneath a modest hat, intelligent eyes scanning the room with purpose rather than fear. Not a working girl, then. Something else. Thomas turned back to his whiskey, determined to finish drowning the memories that haunted him. His brother Jack's body swinging from the old cottonwood after being falsely accused of horse theft. The flames consuming his family's ranch house while Blackstone's men watched with satisfaction. The deed to his land somehow transferred to the mining company through forged papers and corrupt officials. He didn't notice her approach until she was beside him, her clean lavender scent cutting through the miasma of tobacco smoke and spilled beer. "Mr. Lawson." Her voice was clear, educated, with just a hint of Eastern refinement that hadn't yet been worn away by frontier life. Thomas didn't look up. "Don't know you, madam. My name is Beatrice Zimmerman. I've been told you're the man to speak with about transportation to Silver Creek." He gave a bitter laugh. "You've been told wrong. I don't guide anymore. I don't do much of anything useful these days." She studied him for a moment, then slid onto the stool beside him, a bold move for a respectable woman in a place like this. "I can pay well, very well. Not interested." Thomas raised the glass to his lips, but before he could drink, her hand shot out, surprisingly strong, and gripped his wrist. "Please," she said, her voice lower now. "My father is dying. He's in Silver Creek and I need to reach him before." She didn't finish the sentence. Thomas finally looked at her fully, noticing the delicate features that belied the determination in her gaze. She was perhaps 25, with a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded him painfully of his late wife Catherine. "There's a stage that runs there twice weekly. Next one's tomorrow." He tried to lift the glass again, but her grip remained firm. "The stage was robbed 3 days ago. They've suspended service until the sheriff catches the gang responsible." Her eyes narrowed. "And I believe you know very well there isn't another scheduled for 10 days. "Not my problem," Thomas muttered, though something in her desperation was beginning to cut through his alcohol-numbed indifference. In a swift, unexpected movement, Beatrice took the glass from his hand and poured the amber liquid onto the floor. The entire saloon seemed to fall silent at this shocking act. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Thomas growled, rising to his feet. She stood her ground, chin raised. "Offering you something better than slow suicide, Mr. Lawson, a purpose, payment. And perhaps a chance to be the man I suspect you once were, before whatever tragedy brought you to this state." Thomas was about to unleash a torrent of anger when Murphy the bartender spoke up. "The lady's right, Tom. Jack wouldn't want to see you like this." The mention of his brother's name was like a physical blow. Thomas sank back onto his stool, suddenly exhausted. You don't know the first thing about me, Miss Zimmerman. I know you were once the best guide in the territory. I know you fought alongside General Howard against the Nez Perce and saved 17 settlers during the Battle of Wilson's Creek. I know you've been drinking yourself to death since losing your ranch to the Montana Mining Consortium 6 months ago. She paused. And I know my father is dying, and you're the only hope I have of reaching him in time. Thomas stared at her, suspicion growing. How do you know so much about me? I've spent the last 3 days asking questions in town while waiting for someone to take me to Silver Creek. Your name kept coming up both as the man who could do it and as the man who no longer would. Her expression softened slightly. My father is Dr. Joshua Zimmerman. He treated your brother once for a bullet wound in his shoulder. The name registered dimly through Thomas's whiskey-fogged memory. An older doctor with kind eyes and steady hands who'd refused payment, saying only that Thomas should help someone else someday in return. $500, Beatrice said, reaching into her reticule and placing a stack of bills on the counter. Half now, half when we arrive. The sum was staggering enough to buy a small homestead or a decent herd of cattle. Thomas eyed the money, then looked back at her face. Behind the determination, he saw fear and genuine worry for her father. Silver Creek is a 4-day ride through rough country, he said, his voice slightly less harsh. There's been Indian trouble near Cougar Pass, and those same bandits who hit the stage are still out there. I'm aware of the risks. Can you ride? Yes, well enough. Thomas sighed heavily, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. I'll need supplies, and I don't have a horse for you. For the first time, Beatrice smiled a small, hopeful expression that somehow made the dim saloon seem brighter. I've already purchased 2 horses and basic supplies. They're at the livery stable. I just need someone who knows the way and can keep us alive. Thomas looked at the money, then at the empty glass, and finally at her face. Something stirred within him, not hope exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin. We leave at dawn, he said gruffly, standing up. And if you ever pour out my whiskey again, I'll leave you to find your own way through the mountains. Her smile widened slightly. Fair enough, Mr. Lawson. Thomas, he corrected, suddenly uncomfortable with the formality. If we're going to be riding together for 4 days, you might as well use my name. Thomas, she repeated, and I'm Beatrice. He nodded curtly, picked up the money and headed for the door, suddenly eager to escape both the suffocating atmosphere of the saloon and the strange effect this woman was having on his carefully cultivated numbness. He paused at the threshold. Dawn, he repeated without turning around. Don't be late. As Thomas stepped out into the cooling evening air, he drew a deep breath, the first in months that wasn't taken merely out of necessity. The whiskey fog was beginning to clear from his mind, and with it came the painful clarity he'd been trying so desperately to avoid. But there was something else too, a faint sense of purpose that had been absent since he'd watched his brother swing from that tree. For the first time since that terrible day, Thomas Lawson was sober at sunset. And somehow, that felt significant. True to her word, Beatrice was waiting at the livery when Thomas arrived before first light. She wore practical riding clothes, canvas trousers beneath a split skirt, a man's cotton shirt, and a leather vest. Her hair was braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Only the delicate features of her face betrayed her as a woman unused to frontier life. You look surprised, she said, noticing his expression as he inspected the horses she'd purchased. Did you expect me to attempt this journey in a corset and bustle? Thomas continued checking the cinch on the sorrel gelding. The horses are decent stock, you chose well. The liveryman helped. I told him we needed animals that could handle mountain trails. She handed him a rifle case. I also purchased this. The shopkeeper said it's reliable. Thomas opened the case to find a new Winchester repeating rifle. He whistled low. This must have set you back another 100 at least. My father's life is worth every penny, she replied simply. Thomas nodded, loading their supplies onto the pack horses. He'd spent the previous evening organizing provisions, checking his maps, and fighting the urge to return to the saloon. His head throbbed from the lack of whiskey, but his hands were steadier than they'd been in months. As they rode out of town, the sun was just cresting the eastern mountains, painting the world in gold and promise. Thomas led them north, following the winding trail that would eventually take them to Silver Creek. For the first hour they rode in silence, Beatrice seemingly content to follow his lead. "Your father," Thomas finally said, breaking the quiet. "What ails him?" Beatrice's expression tightened. "Consumption. He's been fighting it for years, but his last letter said the doctors have given him weeks at most. He moved to Silver Creek 2 years ago, hoping the mountain air would help his lungs. And your mother, she passed when I was 16. It's been just my father and me since then." She adjusted her hat against the strengthening sun. "He sent me east to school, insisting I get a proper education. I was teaching at a ladies' seminary in Boston when his letter arrived." Thomas nodded, his respect for her growing. The journey from Boston to Montana Territory was arduous even for a man, let alone a woman traveling alone. "You came a long way." "He's all I have," she said simply. They rode steadily through the morning, the trail gradually climbing as they approached the foothills. Beatrice proved to be a competent rider, maintaining the pace without complaint despite what must have been growing discomfort for someone unaccustomed to long days in the saddle. By midday, they'd reached a small stream where Thomas called a halt to rest the horses. As Beatrice dismounted, he noticed her wince slightly. "We'll stop here for an hour," he said. "There's a harder stretch ahead." "I'm fine to continue," she insisted, though her stiff movements betrayed her. Thomas shook his head. "The horses need rest even if you don't. And we need to conserve their strength for Cougar Pass tomorrow." He busied himself with the horses while Beatrice unpacked some food: dried beef, hardtack, and apples. They ate in companionable silence, sitting on sun-warmed rocks beside the burbling stream. "May I ask about your brother?" Beatrice ventured after a while. "You don't have to answer if it's too painful." Thomas stared at the water for a long moment. He hadn't spoken of Jack to anyone since the hanging. He was falsely accused of stealing horses from the Montana Mining Consortium. "Blackstone, the company's enforcer, and his men caught him near our property line. They hanged him without trial." His voice was flat, emotionless. "By the time I found him, he'd been dead for hours." Beatrice's hand covered her mouth. "My God, and the authorities?" Thomas gave a bitter laugh. "The local marshal is in Blackstone's pocket, called it frontier justice and closed the case. 6 weeks later, Blackstone showed up with papers claiming our land had been sold to the company. When I contested it, our house mysteriously caught fire in the night. He picked up a stone and threw it into the stream. I got out with the clothes on my back and my horse, nothing else." "That's why you were drinking," she said softly. "To forget. To numb," he corrected. "Forgetting isn't possible." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Thomas felt uncomfortably exposed, as though she could see straight through to the wounded core of him. "We should move on," he said abruptly, standing. "I want to reach Harper's Canyon by nightfall." They made good time through the afternoon, the trail winding higher into the pine-covered foothills. Thomas kept a vigilant watch for signs of trouble, but they encountered only a lone prospector heading toward town and a small herd of deer that bounded away at their approach. As dusk began to fall, they reached Harper's Canyon, a sheltered ravine with a small spring and enough grazing for the horses. Thomas quickly set about making camp while Beatrice gathered firewood from the surrounding area. "You've done this before," he observed as she efficiently arranged the kindling. "My father took me camping in the Adirondacks every summer until I was 18, she explained. "He believed girls should learn practical skills as well as needlepoint and piano." Thomas struck a match, and soon they had a cheerful fire crackling in the gathering darkness. He prepared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and coffee, which they ate while the stars emerged above. "Tomorrow will be the hardest day," Thomas warned as they finished eating. "Cougar Pass is steep and narrow in places. We'll need to lead the horses through some sections." Beatrice nodded, her face serious in the firelight. "And the Indian trouble you mentioned? A band of young Crow warriors has been raiding isolated travelers. Not a full-scale uprising, but dangerous enough." He checked his rifle and pistol. "We'll move carefully and keep our eyes open." "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For doing this, I know you didn't want to." Thomas looked at her across the fire, struck by how the flickering light softened her features and brought out gold highlights in her hair. "You didn't give me much choice," he replied, but there was no rancor in his tone. Pouring out a man's whiskey is a serious offense in these parts. A smile tugged at her lips. "I'll remember that." As they settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Thomas found himself more aware of her presence than he wanted to be. It had been a long time since he'd spent this much time with anyone, let alone a woman of intelligence and spirit. The realization that he might be beginning to care about her welfare beyond their business arrangement was unsettling. He stared up at the vast canopy of stars, listening to her breathing gradually slow and deepen. His own body ached for whiskey, but for the first time in months, the craving seemed less important than the responsibility he'd undertaken. With that thought, he finally drifted into a dreamless sleep. The attack came shortly before dawn. Thomas woke instantly at the sound of a horse's nervous whinny, hand already reaching for his pistol. Years of frontier living had taught him to distinguish between ordinary animal sounds and those of alarm. He rolled silently from his bedroll, gesturing for Beatrice, who had also awakened, to remain still. The pale light of approaching dawn revealed 3 shadowy figures moving among the trees at the edge of their camp. Not Indians, their outlines showed the distinctive shapes of cowboy hats and long coats. Bandits, then, likely the same ones who'd been plaguing the area. "I know you're there," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "We don't have much worth stealing, but we've got plenty of bullets for anyone who tries." A harsh laugh answered him. "Big talk from a man outnumbered 3-1, throw out your weapons and no one gets hurt." "Not going to happen," Thomas replied calmly, moving to position himself between the outlaws and Beatrice. "Ride on and find easier pickings." Instead of answering, one of the men fired, the bullet splintering bark from a tree inches from Thomas's head. He returned fire immediately, the report of his pistol shattering the dawn quiet. One of the shadows crumpled with a cry of pain. "You shouldn't have done that," growled another voice, and suddenly gunfire erupted from the trees. Thomas dove for cover behind a large boulder, pulling Beatrice with him. "Stay down," he ordered, reaching for the Winchester. "I can shoot," she said, surprising him by drawing a small derringer from her boot. "Father insisted I learn." Before he could respond, 2 of the bandits broke cover, firing as they ran toward new positions. Thomas sighted carefully and squeezed the trigger. One man fell with a scream, clutching his leg. The other ducked behind a fallen log. "Come out now, and maybe we'll just take your horses and supplies," the remaining man called. "Keep fighting, and the woman won't live to see Silver Creek." Thomas's jaw tightened. "When I move to the left, fire your derringer at the log where he's hiding," he whispered to Beatrice. "You don't need to hit him, just keep him pinned down." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Thomas counted silently to 3, then broke cover, running in a crouch toward a cluster of rocks that would give him a better angle on the outlaw's position. As planned, Beatrice fired her small pistol, forcing the bandit to keep his head down. Thomas reached the rocks and steadied his rifle. When the man raised his head slightly to look for him, Thomas fired. The shot caught the outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. "It's over," Thomas called. "Drop your gun or the next one goes through your heart." With a curse, the wounded man let his pistol fall to the ground. "Don't shoot, I'm done." Thomas approached cautiously, rifle trained on the bandit's chest. He was a scruffy individual with a week's growth of beard and wild eyes that darted between Thomas and Beatrice, who had emerged from behind the boulder. "Your friends," Thomas said coldly. "Are they part of the gang that's been robbing stages?" The man spat. What's it to you? Answer him, Beatrice said, her derringer pointed steadily at the outlaw. The transformation from civilized schoolteacher to fierce frontier woman was remarkable. Yeah, that was us, the man admitted sullenly, along with a couple others. Thomas nodded. Here's what's going to happen. You and your wounded friends are going to mount up and ride back the way we came. When you reach Clearwater Springs, you'll turn yourselves in to Sheriff Daniels. The outlaw laughed. And why would we do that? Because if you don't, Thomas said quietly, I'll hunt you down and finish what I started here. And I won't be nearly as merciful next time. Something in Thomas's eyes, the cold, hard look of a man who had lost everything and therefore feared nothing, convinced the bandit he was serious. All right, he muttered. We'll go. Thomas kept his rifle trained on the three outlaws as they mounted their horses, the two wounded men helped by their companion. As they rode away down the trail, he remained vigilant until they were out of sight. Only then did he turn to Beatrice, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Are you all right? He asked, suddenly concerned by her stillness. She nodded slowly. Yes, She hesitated. I've never seen anyone shot before. Thomas's face softened slightly. They'll live. I aimed for limbs, not vitals. You could have killed them easily. It wasn't a question. Yes, he acknowledged, but more death won't bring back what I've lost. He began packing their belongings, aware that they'd lost valuable travel time. We should move on. Those three probably won't double back, but I don't want to take chances. As they mounted up and continued their journey, Thomas noticed a subtle change in Beatrice's demeanor toward him, a new respect mingled with curiosity. She rode closer to him than before, occasionally asking questions about the land they were passing through or the wildlife they encountered. By midday, they reached the base of Cougar Pass. The trail ahead wound steeply upward between towering rock walls, in places barely wide enough for a single horse to pass. This is where we need to be especially careful, Thomas explained, dismounting. We'll lead the horses through the narrowest sections. Stay close to me and watch your footing. The rocks can be loose. Beatrice followed his example, taking her horse's reins and walking beside him as they began the ascent. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the pine-scented breeze carrying the faint cries of hawks circling overhead. It's beautiful, Beatrice remarked, pausing to look back at the vista of forested valleys spreading out below them. Harsh but beautiful, Thomas followed her gaze. Yes, he agreed quietly. That's the West in a nutshell, beautiful enough to break your heart, harsh enough to break your spirit. Yet you stayed, she observed. Even after everything that happened, he shrugged. Nowhere else to go, and despite it all, this land gets in your blood. He gestured for them to continue moving. Besides, I still have unfinished business with Blackstone and the Montana Mining Consortium. Beatrice gave him a sharp look. Revenge, Justice, Thomas corrected, though I haven't figured out how to get it yet. They continued in thoughtful silence, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous. In the narrowest section, Thomas went first, leading his horse carefully over the rocky path while Beatrice waited with the packhorses. When he reached a wider area, he called for her to follow. She had just started forward when a small avalanche of rocks cascaded down from above, startling her horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly pulling Beatrice off her feet. Thomas rushed back, grabbing the reins just as more rocks tumbled down, one striking him on the shoulder. Move. He shouted, pulling her and the frightened horse toward the safety of the wider section. They reached it just as a larger rockfall crashed down on the spot where they'd been standing, breathing hard. Thomas checked Beatrice for injuries. Are you hurt? She shook her head, her face pale. Just shaken. You're bleeding. Thomas glanced at his shoulder where a jagged cut had torn through his shirt. It's nothing. Rock slides are common here, that's why I wanted us to move through quickly. Beatrice insisted on cleaning and bandaging the wound before they continued, her touch gentle but efficient as she worked. Thomas found himself acutely aware of her closeness, the scent of lavender still somehow clinging to her despite their days on the trail. Thank you, she said softly as she tied off the bandage. "You saved my life back there." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something electric passed between them, a connection that went beyond their business arrangement or even their growing friendship. Thomas broke the contact first, uncomfortable with the warmth spreading through him. "We should keep moving," he said gruffly. "I want to be over the pass before nightfall." They resumed their journey, the trail eventually widening enough to ride again. By late afternoon, they had crested the pass and begun the descent on the other side. The western slope was less steep, with more vegetation and signs of wildlife. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a small meadow beside a clear mountain stream. Thomas built a fire while Beatrice prepared their meal, working together in comfortable silence broken only by necessary communication. Over dinner, Beatrice asked, "How much farther to Silver Creek?" "If we make good time tomorrow, we should arrive by mid-afternoon the day after," Thomas replied. "The trail improves once we reach the valley floor." She nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you again. I know this journey hasn't been easy." Thomas studied her across the fire, noting the determination that had carried her this far despite the dangers and discomforts. "You're tougher than you look, Miss Zimmerman." A smile touched her lips. "I thought we agreed on Beatrice, and thank you, I think." It was a compliment, he assured her. Most Eastern ladies would have collapsed at the first sign of bandits or rock slides. "I'm not most Eastern ladies." Her smile faded into seriousness. "My father always said that character reveals itself in adversity, that when the trappings of civilization are stripped away, we discover who we truly are." "And who are you, Beatrice Zimmerman?" Thomas asked quietly. She considered the question for a long moment. "I'm still discovering that, I think. This journey has certainly been illuminating." She turned the question back to him. "And you? Who is Thomas Lawson when he's not drowning in whiskey?" The blunt query should have angered him, but somehow it didn't. "A man who failed to protect what mattered most," he answered honestly. "A man with no direction. Until now," she pointed out. "You have a direction for the next 2 days at least." Thomas acknowledged this with a slight nod, and then back to Clearwater Springs, I suppose, to resume drinking. There was no judgment in her tone, only genuine curiosity. He stared into the fire, watching the dancing flames. "I don't know," he admitted. "It seems less necessary than it did 3 days ago." Their conversation drifted to safer topics: Beatrice's life in Boston, Thomas's early days as a scout for the Army, shared observations about the natural beauty surrounding them. As night deepened, Thomas found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months, the constant tension in his shoulders easing slightly. When they finally retired to their bedrolls, he lay awake for some time, listening to the night sounds and pondering the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been determined to drink himself into oblivion. Now he was guiding a remarkable woman through dangerous territory, feeling more alive than he had since Jack's death. The realization that he might be developing feelings for Beatrice was both unsettling and exhilarating. But what future could there possibly be? She was an educated Easterner with prospects and a life to return to. He was a broken man with nothing but a thirst for vengeance and a talent for survival in a harsh land. With these troubled thoughts, Thomas finally drifted into sleep, his dreams for once free of his brother's swinging body and burning homestead. The morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer season. They broke camp efficiently and continued their journey, the trail now leading downward through increasingly lush forest. By midday, they had reached the valley floor, where the path widened into a proper road that showed signs of regular travel. They made good time through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. As dusk approached, Thomas led them to a small clearing beside a meandering creek, their last camp before reaching Silver Creek. While he tended to the horses, Beatrice gathered firewood and started preparing their evening meal. "We should reach your father by midday tomorrow," Thomas said as they ate. The road from here is well-traveled and relatively safe. Beatrice nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and anxiety. I pray we're not too late. Your father sounds like a fighter, Thomas offered, and doctors often know how to extend their own lives better than most. She smiled gratefully at his attempt at comfort. He is stubborn. It's where I get it from, he always said. After dinner, they sat by the fire, neither seeming eager to retire despite the long day of travel. The night was unusually warm, with a full moon rising above the eastern mountains, bathing the clearing in silver light. What will you do? Thomas asked suddenly. After. Whatever happens with your father. Beatrice looked up, surprised by the question. I haven't thought that far ahead. If he's well enough to travel, perhaps take him back east where medical care is better. If not, she swallowed hard. I don't know. Thomas nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. And if he's gone when we arrive, then I'll bury him properly and decide after. Her voice was steady despite the painful subject. What about you? Will you return to whiskey and oblivion in Clearwater Springs? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas tossed the stick into the flames. I've been thinking about that, about what comes next. And, she prompted when he didn't continue. And I'm not sure drowning my sorrows is working out so well, he admitted, these past few days. I've remembered what it feels like to have a purpose, to be useful. You could guide others, Beatrice suggested. Your skills are valuable out here. Thomas shook his head. Maybe, but there's still the matter of Blackstone and what he did to Jack, to our land. His jaw tightened. I can't just let that stand. Revenge won't bring your brother back, she said softly. I know that, but justice might bring me peace. He looked at her directly. Wouldn't you want the same if someone had taken everything from you? Beatrice held his gaze. I would want justice, yes. But not at the cost of my soul, and not if it meant living the rest of my life looking backward instead of forward. Her words struck him with unexpected force. For months, his thoughts had been consumed by the past, by loss and rage and guilt. The possibility of a future beyond vengeance hadn't seemed real. Sometimes, she continued gently, the best revenge is living well, building something new from the ashes of what was lost. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the compassion in her eyes. Thomas found himself drawn to her in a way that went beyond physical attraction, a connection of spirits that he hadn't experienced since Catherine. You're an unusual woman, Beatrice Zimmerman, he said finally. Your father raised you well. She smiled, a hint of sadness in the expression. He did his best. I hope I get to tell him that again. An impulse Thomas couldn't explain made him reach across the space between them and take her hand. Her fingers were smaller than his but strong, and they curled around his without hesitation. You will, he promised, though he had no way of knowing if it was true. We'll reach Silver Creek tomorrow. They sat like that for several minutes, hands joined in the space between them, neither speaking but communicating nonetheless. When Beatrice finally withdrew her hand and stood to retire to her bedroll, Thomas felt the absence of her touch like a physical thing. Good night, Thomas, she said softly. Good night, Beatrice, he replied, watching as she settled on the other side of the fire. Long after her breathing had deepened into sleep, he remained awake, staring at the stars and wondering at the strange turns life could take. The next morning dawned bright and clear, both of them rising early with the knowledge that their journey was nearing its conclusion. They broke camp quickly and set out on the final leg to Silver Creek, the well-traveled road allowing them to make excellent time. As they rode, Thomas noticed Beatrice growing increasingly tense, her hands tight on the reins, her gaze fixed ahead as though she could will Silver Creek to appear on the horizon. He understood her anxiety all too well, the fear of arriving too late, of finding only a grave instead of a reunion. Tell me more about your father, he said, hoping to distract her from her worries. What kind of doctor is he? Beatrice's expression softened at the question. A general practitioner, but with a special interest in pulmonary diseases, ironic, given his own condition. He served as an army surgeon during the war, which is where he first contracted the illness that eventually became consumption. A brave man, Thomas commented. Yes, and kind. He never turned away a patient who couldn't pay. Sometimes he'd come home with chickens or vegetables instead of money. She smiled at the memory. After Mother died, he threw himself into his work even more. I think helping others was his way of coping with grief. Thomas nodded, understanding this all too well. And he encouraged your education, insisted on it. Said a woman with a mind is better equipped for life's hardships than one with merely social graces. Her expression grew thoughtful. He would like you, I think. A whiskey-soaked former rancher with a grudge, Thomas raised an eyebrow skeptically. A man of principle who keeps his word and protects those in his care, she corrected. He always valued character above circumstance. Thomas felt warmed by her assessment, though he wasn't sure he deserved it. I hope I get the chance to meet him properly. By midday, the first buildings of Silver Creek came into view, a typical frontier town, somewhat larger than Clearwater Springs, with a main street lined with wooden structures and the occasional brick building indicating greater prosperity. Beatrice straightened in her saddle, her excitement palpable. We made it, she breathed, urging her horse to a faster pace. Thomas matched her speed, riding beside her as they entered the town. Do you know where he's staying? He mentioned boarding with a Mrs. Henderson on Pine Street in his letters. Beatrice's eyes scanned the buildings eagerly. We should ask at the general store for directions. They dismounted outside a large mercantile, tying their horses to the hitching post. Inside, a balding shopkeeper looked up from his ledger as they entered. Afternoon, folks, new in town. We're looking for Dr. Joshua Zimmerman, Beatrice said without preamble. He's boarding with a Mrs. Henderson on Pine Street. The shopkeeper's face underwent a subtle change that made Thomas's stomach tighten with apprehension. You'd be the doctor's daughter, then? He asked carefully. Yes, Beatrice Zimmerman. Is my father still? He's alive, miss, the man assured her quickly. But took a turn for the worse 2 days ago. Mrs. Henderson's place is 3 blocks north, then 2 east. The blue house with white trim. Beatrice's relief at the news that her father still lived was tempered by concern over his worsening condition. She thanked the shopkeeper hurriedly and rushed outside, Thomas following close behind. We can leave the horses at the livery and walk from here, he suggested, seeing her impatience. It's faster than trying to navigate the streets on horseback. She nodded gratefully, and after quickly arranging stabling for their mounts, they made their way through the bustling town toward Pine Street. Beatrice set a brisk pace, her earlier fatigue seemingly forgotten in her eagerness to reach her father. The Henderson house was easily identifiable, a neat 2-story structure with blue clapboard siding and white trim around the windows and doors. A small brass plaque beside the entrance indicated that rooms were available for respectable boarders. Beatrice hesitated on the porch, suddenly uncertain now that her goal was within reach. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He's waited for you, he said simply. Don't keep him waiting longer. She nodded, squared her shoulders, and knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal a plump, middle-aged woman with a kind face framed by gray streaked hair. Mrs. Henderson, Beatrice inquired. I'm Beatrice Zimmerman, Dr. Zimmerman's daughter. The woman's face lit up with relief. Oh, thank the Lord, we've been praying you'd arrive in time. Come in, come in. He's been asking for you. They stepped into a tidy foyer, Mrs. Henderson already hurrying toward the staircase. He's had a difficult few days, but he's been holding on something fierce. Said he wouldn't go until he saw his bee one more time. Beatrice's composure faltered at these words, and Thomas instinctively moved closer, offering silent support. She gave him a grateful glance before following Mrs. Henderson up the stairs. I'll wait down here, Thomas said quietly, feeling this reunion should be private. Beatrice paused, turning back to him. Please come up, I'd like him to meet you. Surprised but touched by the request, Thomas nodded and followed her up the stairs. Mrs. Henderson led them to a door at the end of the hallway, knocking gently before opening it. Dr. Zimmerman. "Someone's here to see you," she announced, stepping aside to allow Beatrice to enter. The room was simply but comfortably furnished, with large windows allowing plenty of light. In a bed near the window lay an elderly man, his once robust frame now gaunt, his breathing labored but his eyes alert and bright with intelligence. "B," he called, his voice weak but clear. "Is it really you, Father?" Beatrice rushed to his bedside, taking his thin hand in both of hers. "Yes, it's me. I came as quickly as I could." Dr. Zimmerman's face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away despite his illness. "My dear girl, I knew you'd make it." His gaze shifted to Thomas, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "And who is this?" Beatrice beckoned Thomas forward. "This is Thomas Lawson. He guided me safely from Clearwater Springs when the stage service was suspended. I wouldn't have reached you without him." The old doctor studied Thomas with keen eyes that seemed to see more than most. "Then I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Lawson. My daughter is the most precious thing in the world to me." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "No debt, sir. Your daughter is determined. She would have found a way with or without me." Dr. Zimmerman smiled weakly. "That sounds like my B." A coughing fit seized him, and Beatrice quickly poured water from a pitcher beside the bed, helping him drink. "Mrs. Henderson, could you bring some fresh water and perhaps some broth?" she asked. "And Father's medicine?" "Of course, dear." The landlady bustled out, leaving the three of them alone. "How bad is it, really?" Beatrice asked once the door closed, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Her father sighed. "Bad enough, I'm afraid. The local doctor gives me a week, perhaps two." He squeezed her hand. "But seeing you has already added days to that estimate, I'm certain." Thomas, feeling intrusive during this personal moment, began to back toward the door. "I should let you two talk. I'll check on the horses and find lodging in town." "Wait," Dr. Zimmerman called, his voice surprisingly strong. "B, would you give Mr. Lawson and me a moment alone? Perhaps you could help Mrs. Henderson with that broth." Beatrice looked surprised but nodded, placing a kiss on her father's forehead before leaving the room. When the door closed behind her, the old doctor gestured for Thomas to come closer. "I remember you, young man," he said quietly. "Though you may not remember me, I treated your brother Jack for a bullet wound some years back." Thomas nodded. "Beatrice mentioned it." "I do remember you refused payment. And now you've repaid that debt many times over by bringing my daughter safely to me." The old man's eyes were shrewd. "But that's not why you did it, is it?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "She was very persuasive, doctor." Zimmerman chuckled, which triggered another bout of coughing. When it subsided, he fixed Thomas with a penetrating gaze. "I'm a dying man, Mr. Lawson, which grants me certain liberties. One of those is speaking plainly. I see how you look at my daughter." Thomas felt heat rise to his face, unused to being so transparent. "Sir, I assure you, no need for assurances. I'm not accusing you of impropriety." The doctor waved a thin hand dismissively. "I'm merely observing that there's a connection between you. I saw it the moment you both entered this room." Unsure how to respond, Thomas remained silent. "Life is precious and all too brief, Mr. Lawson. I've watched too many people waste their chances at happiness." Dr. Zimmerman's expression grew solemn. "My daughter tells me you've suffered great losses, that you've been trying to drown those sorrows in whiskey." Thomas stiffened. "She had no right to. She had every right as someone who cares about you," the doctor interrupted firmly. "And I have every right as her father to ask, what are your intentions once I'm gone?" The blunt question caught Thomas off guard. I haven't thought that far ahead." "Then perhaps you should start. Beatrice will need someone when I pass. Not immediately, she's strong and independent. But eventually." The old man's gaze was unwavering. "Could that someone be you, Mr. Lawson? Not as you are now, but as the man you could be if you chose life instead of slow death by whiskey." Thomas found himself unable to look away from those knowing eyes. "I don't know if I'm capable of being that man anymore," he admitted quietly. Everyone is capable of redemption, son. The question is whether they're willing to do the hard work required. Dr. Zimmerman's voice softened. I've seen too many good men destroy themselves after loss. Don't be one of them. Before Thomas could respond, the door opened and Beatrice returned, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of broth and fresh water. Her gaze moved between her father and Thomas, curiosity evident in her expression. Everything all right? She asked. Just getting acquainted, her father replied with a smile. Mr. Lawson was telling me about your journey. Thomas recognized the lie for what it was, a private moment kept private, and played along. Your father was just thanking me for bringing you safely to Silver Creek. Beatrice seemed to accept this explanation, turning her attention to helping her father sit up to take some broth. Thomas watched the tender interaction, struck by the deep bond between them and feeling oddly privileged to witness it. I'll leave you two to your reunion, he said after a few minutes. I'll be at the hotel if you need anything. Beatrice looked up, concern in her eyes. Will you come back tomorrow? Father should rest now, but I'm sure he'd like to speak with you more when he's stronger. Of course, Thomas agreed, strangely reluctant to leave despite knowing they needed time alone together. Good day, Dr. Zimmerman. Rest well. The old man nodded, his eyes already drooping with fatigue. Remember what I said, Mr. Lawson. Life is too short for regrets. As Thomas left the Henderson house, he found himself turning the doctor's words over in his mind. The question of what came next after Silver Creek, after Dr. Zimmerman's inevitable passing suddenly, seemed more pressing than it had before. For months, his only thought had been of vengeance against Blackstone and the mining company. But now, walking through the sunlit streets of Silver Creek, Thomas found himself considering other possibilities. Possibilities that included the remarkable woman he'd come to admire over the past 4 days. But first, he needed to make peace with his past. And that required clarity of mind that whiskey couldn't provide. At the hotel, Thomas checked into a modest room, paying for a week in advance. Then, instead of heading to the saloon as his body craved, he found the bathhouse and paid for a proper bath, a shave, and had his clothes laundered. Clean and somewhat refreshed, he sought out the local telegraph office and sent a message to Sheriff Daniels in Clearwater Springs, inquiring whether the bandits they'd encountered had indeed turned themselves in. It was a small matter in the grand scheme of things, but somehow it felt important to close that chapter properly. As evening fell, Thomas found himself standing outside the town's largest saloon, the Golden Nugget. The familiar sounds of piano music and raucous laughter drifted through the batwing doors, along with the scent of whiskey and tobacco smoke. His throat burned with thirst, his hands trembling slightly with the need that had become so familiar. For several long minutes, he stood frozen in indecision, the pull of old habits warring with the new sense of purpose that had begun to take root during the journey with Beatrice. In his mind, he could see Jack's face, not swinging from the cottonwood but smiling as they worked together on their ranch. He could hear Dr. Zimmerman's words, "Life is too short for regrets." With a deep breath, Thomas turned and walked away from the saloon, heading instead to a small restaurant where he ordered a solid meal and coffee. It wasn't a permanent solution to his demons, but it was a starter choice to face one evening without numbing himself. As he ate, he found himself thinking of Beatrice, her courage, her determination, her compassion. The way she had reached for his hand and poured away his whiskey that first day in Clearwater Springs, offering him something better than slow suicide. The realization that he might be falling in love with her was both terrifying and exhilarating. But love required something from him that he wasn't sure he could give, a future. And before he could offer that to anyone, he needed to resolve his past. With that thought firmly in mind, Thomas finished his meal and returned to his hotel room, where he spent the evening planning not revenge, but justice, a way to expose Blackstone and the mining company's corruption that wouldn't end with more bloodshed or his own destruction. For the first time in months, he fell asleep with purpose rather than despair in his heart. The next morning, Thomas rose early, had breakfast at the hotel restaurant, and then made his way to the Henderson house. He found Beatrice in the small garden behind the house, sitting on a bench with a cup of tea in her hands, her expression pensive. She looked up at his approach, a smile warming her features. "Thomas, good morning. How is your father today?" he asked, sitting beside her when she gestured to the empty space on the bench. Stronger, surprisingly, having me here seems to have rallied his spirits. She studied his face. "You look different, rested." Thomas nodded. "I slept well and I didn't visit the saloon last night." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "That's good. One night doesn't make a new man," he cautioned, "but it's a start." Beatrice's smile deepened. "A worthy start. Father's been asking about you this morning. He seems quite taken with you despite your brief conversation. He's an insightful man." Thomas hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what comes next, after Silver Creek." "Oh," she set down her teacup, giving him her full attention. "I still need to deal with Blackstone and what he did to my brother, to my land, but not the way I was planning." Thomas met her gaze directly. "Not with more violence. With the law." Beatrice's expression showed surprised approval. "How?" "I spent last night remembering details, names of witnesses to the false accusation against Jack, dates of land transactions that can be investigated. The mining company left a paper trail, and with the right help, I believe I can expose their corruption." His jaw tightened with determination. "The territorial governor is known to be honest. If I can get evidence to him, bypassing the local authorities who are in Blackstone's pocket." "That would take time," Beatrice observed, "and resources." "Yes, but it would be justice, not revenge." Thomas took a deep breath. "Your father said something yesterday that made me think about choosing life instead of slow death." Beatrice's eyes softened. "He has that effect on people. It's what made him such a good doctor. He sees beyond the immediate symptoms to the deeper causes." "He sees clearly," Thomas agreed. "And he made me see something I've been avoiding, that I've been using whiskey to punish myself for failing to save Jack. That I've been choosing death because I didn't think I deserved life." Beatrice reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and steady. "And now I'm not so sure." He turned his hand to clasp hers. "These past 5 days with you have reminded me that there might be something worth living for, something beyond vengeance or guilt." A faint blush colored Beatrice's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I've felt it too," she admitted softly. "This connection between us. It seems impossible we barely know each other." "Don't we?" Thomas smiled slightly. 4 days on the trail together, facing danger, sharing stories. I think I know the essence of you, Beatrice Zimmerman, your courage, your compassion. Your stubborn determination to pour out a stranger's whiskey when you think he needs saving." She laughed, the sound like music in the quiet garden. "And I know you, Thomas Lawson, a man of honor beneath the grief, a protector, someone who keeps his word even when it's difficult." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, hands still joined, each contemplating the unexpected turn their lives had taken. "Father wants to speak with you again," Beatrice said finally. "He's more alert this morning." Thomas nodded, standing and offering her his arm in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and right. She took it, and together they entered the house and made their way upstairs to Dr. Zimmerman's room. The old doctor was sitting up in bed, looking indeed stronger than the previous day. His eyes brightened at the sight of them entering together, arm in arm. "Ah, Mr. Lawson, I'm glad you returned." He gestured to the chairs beside his bed. "Sit, both of you, I have matters to discuss." Once they were seated, Dr. Zimmerman fixed Thomas with that penetrating gaze again. "Have you considered our conversation from yesterday?" Thomas nodded, aware of Beatrice's curious look. "I have, sir, and I've made some decisions." "Good, good." The doctor turned to his daughter. I need to speak plainly. My time is short and there are arrangements to be made." "Father, please," Beatrice began, distress evident in her voice. "You're stronger today. Perhaps with proper care, my dear girl. I am a doctor. I know the signs better than most." His tone was gentle but firm. I may have days or weeks, but not months. And I need to know you'll be all right after I'm gone. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, but she blinked them back, straightening her shoulders. I will be, I promise. I know you're strong, but even the strongest need purpose. Dr. Zimmerman's gaze moved between his daughter and Thomas. Which is why I have a proposal for both of you. Thomas raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was heading. Mr. Lawson, you mentioned yesterday that you seek justice for your brother. That requires evidence, witnesses, legal proceedings. The doctor's eyes were sharp despite his illness. And my daughter, as it happens, is not only well educated but has experience assisting me with medical records and correspondence. Beatrice looked startled. Father, what are you suggesting? A partnership, my dear, a practical arrangement to start. He smiled slightly. Mr. Lawson needs assistance gathering evidence against those who wronged his family. You need a purpose to focus on after my passing, to prevent grief from overwhelming you. Thomas stared at the old man, both impressed and slightly unnerved by his directness. Sir, with all due respect, I couldn't ask Miss Zimmerman to. You're not asking, I'm suggesting. Dr. Zimmerman waved a thin hand dismissively. B has a keen mind and a sense of justice that rivals your own. Together, you might accomplish what neither could alone. Beatrice looked at Thomas, a mixture of emotions playing across her face. It's not an unreasonable suggestion, she said slowly. I had planned to return east after everything here is settled, but I find I'm not eager to resume my former life. This would be dangerous, Thomas warned. Blackstone is not a man who forgives those who challenge him. All the more reason not to face him alone, she countered. Dr. Zimmerman nodded approvingly. 2 heads are better than 1, and 4 eyes see more than 2. Another coughing fit seized him, and Beatrice quickly helped him sip water. When he had recovered, the doctor continued more softly. I don't ask for promises of anything beyond this practical arrangement. What grows between you, friendship, partnership, or something more, should develop naturally. His eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. Though an old man might hope for grandchildren eventually. Father, Beatrice exclaimed, her cheeks flushing crimson. Thomas found himself both embarrassed and strangely moved by the old man's frankness. I can't offer much, sir. I have no land, no home, but you have purpose, doctor. Zimmerman interrupted, and honor, and a heart that's healing. He reached out, taking one of Thomas's hands and one of Beatrice's, joining them together. Sometimes that's enough to start with. The 3 of them talked for another hour, discussing practical matters, doctor. Zimmerman's will, his modest savings that would provide Beatrice with some financial security, his wishes for burial in Silver Creek rather than transportation back east. Throughout the conversation, Thomas was struck by the old doctor's clear-eyed acceptance of his fate and his practical concern for his daughter's future. There was no self-pity, only a determination to use his remaining time wisely. When Dr. Zimmerman began to tire, Beatrice insisted he rest. As they prepared to leave, the old man called Thomas back for a final private word. Remember what I said about redemption, he murmured, his voice weakening with fatigue. It's never too late to become the man you were meant to be. Thomas nodded, unexpectedly moved. I'll remember, sir. And I'll look after her, whatever she decides. Good man. The doctor's eyes drifted closed. I think I'll rest now. In the hallway outside, Beatrice was waiting, her expression thoughtful. What did he say to you? Just some advice, Thomas replied. Your father is a wise man. She smiled softly. Yes, he always sees more than most. Her expression grew serious. We should talk about his proposal. It's rather unorthodox. Perhaps a walk, Thomas suggested. The hotel has a small garden. Beatrice nodded, and together they left the Henderson house, walking in comfortable silence through the town to the hotel garden, a modest space with a few benches and flower beds. They found a quiet corner away from other guests. Your father is very direct, Thomas began, unsure how to approach the unusual situation. Beatrice laughed lightly. He's always been that way, but his illness has made him even more so. He says there's no time for social niceties when life is short. A fair point. Thomas hesitated, then plunged ahead. "What do you think of his suggestion about us working together to bring Blackstone to justice?" She considered the question carefully. "I think it has merit. I have skills that could be useful: research, writing, organization. And I find I'm not ready to return to Boston and pretend none of this happened. It would be dangerous," Thomas warned again, "and difficult, and there's no guarantee of success." "Few worthwhile things come with guarantees," she pointed out, "and as for danger, I've already faced bandits and rock slides with you. I'm not as fragile as I might appear." Thomas smiled at that. "No, you're certainly not fragile." His expression grew serious again. "But there's another aspect to consider. Your father seems to be matchmaking." Beatrice's cheeks colored slightly, but she met his gaze steadily. "Yes, he is, rather shamelessly, in fact." She took a deep breath. "The question is, does that possibility disturb you?" Thomas considered his answer carefully, knowing its importance. "No," he said finally, "it doesn't disturb me. In fact, it gives me hope I hadn't expected to feel again." Her eyes widened slightly, and he continued, "I've come to admire you greatly, Beatrice. Your courage, your intelligence, your compassion. In just 5 days, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about my future." He took her hand gently. "I can't offer much now. I'm still healing, still finding my way back to the man I used to be, but if you're willing to take that journey with me—" "I am," she said simply, squeezing his hand. "We can start as partners in this quest for justice. And whatever grows between us beyond that friendship or more, we'll face it honestly." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not the entire burden he'd carried since Jack's death, but enough to stand straighter, to breathe more freely. "Then we have a plan, after your father." "After father," she nodded, her eyes sad but determined. "We'll begin our investigation, together." Over the next 2 weeks, Dr. Zimmerman's condition fluctuated, some days finding him alert and engaged, others seeing him too weak to leave his bed. Thomas visited daily, sometimes discussing their plans for investigating Blackstone, sometimes simply sitting with Beatrice as she read to her father or shared memories of their life together. During this time, Thomas remained steadfastly sober, fighting through the physical discomfort of withdrawal with a determination that surprised even him. Each evening, when the craving for whiskey grew strongest, he would walk through town instead of visiting the saloon, sometimes alone with his thoughts, sometimes with Beatrice at his side. They began to develop a comfortable routine: breakfast together at the hotel, visits with Dr. Zimmerman, then afternoons spent in preliminary research. Thomas wrote to contacts from his Army days who might have information about the mining company's other dealings, while Beatrice organized their findings into a coherent narrative. In the evenings, they often walked together, their conversations ranging from childhood memories to favorite books to hopes for the future. Thomas found himself opening up about Catherine, his first wife who had died of fever 3 years before Jack's murder, sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Beatrice told him of her life in Boston, of teaching young women mathematics and literature, of her growing discontent with the constraints placed on women in Eastern society. Slowly, inevitably, their relationship deepened beyond the initial partnership Dr. Zimmerman had proposed. Their hands would find each other as they walked. Their eyes would meet and hold for increasingly longer moments. Their discussions would continue late into the evening, neither wanting to part. On a crisp autumn evening 17 days after their arrival in Silver Creek, Thomas and Beatrice sat together on the porch of the Henderson house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. They had just come from Dr. Zimmerman's room, where the old man had fallen into a peaceful sleep after a day of unusual clarity and strength. "He seems better today," Thomas observed, though they both knew these rallies were often followed by deeper declines. Beatrice nodded, her shoulder touching his as they sat close on the porch swing. "Yes, he was almost his old self for a while. He asked me an interesting question when you went to fetch his medicine," Thomas said after a moment. "Oh," Beatrice turned to look at him, curiosity in her eyes. He asked if I was in love with you yet. Thomas kept his gaze on the sunset, though he was acutely aware of her sudden stillness beside him. What did you tell him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. I told him the truth. That I am falling in love with you, but that I wanted to be worthy of you before I said the words aloud. Beatrice's eyes glistened with unshed tears. And what did he say to that? He said that love isn't about worthiness, that it's about choosing each other, flaws and all, and growing together. Thomas reached up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. He also said I was being foolish to wait, since life is uncertain and time is precious. A tear slipped down Beatrice's cheek, but she was smiling. He's a very wise man, my father. Yes, Thomas agreed, his heart pounding as he leaned closer. So I'm taking his advice. I love you, Beatrice Zimmerman. It seems impossible after such a short time, but I do. Not impossible, she whispered, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. Extraordinary, perhaps. Unexpected, certainly, but not impossible. Her eyes met his with absolute certainty. I love you too, Thomas Lawson. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer both. When they drew apart, Thomas felt a sense of homecoming he hadn't experienced since before Jack's death, before his world had unraveled into grief and rage and whiskey-soaked oblivion. What happens now? Beatrice asked, her hand still resting against his face. Now we continue as we planned, Thomas said. We gather evidence against Blackstone, we seek justice for Jack and for my land, and we do it together. He pressed his forehead against hers. But we do it with hope for the future, not just anger about the past. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson opening the front door, her face grave. Miss Zimmerman, you should come quickly. The doctor is asking for you. They rushed upstairs to find Dr. Zimmerman awake but struggling for breath, his face pale and drawn with effort. "Bea," he gasped, reaching for her hand. "Thomas." "We're here, Father," Beatrice said, taking his hand while Thomas moved to his other side. "Time's short," the old man whispered. "Need to say, proud of you, Bea, always." His gaze shifted to Thomas. "Take care of each other." "We will, sir," Thomas promised, his throat tight with emotion for this man he'd known so briefly yet who had changed the course of his life. Dr. Zimmerman nodded slightly, his breathing becoming more labored. "No regrets," he managed. "Lived well, loved well." His eyes fixed on his daughter. "Be happy, my Bea, promise me." "I promise, Father," she said, tears flowing freely now. "I love you." A smile touched the old doctor's lips. "Love you too." His gaze moved to Thomas again. "Told you, redemption possible." "Yes, sir, you did." Thomas blinked back his own tears. "Good, doctor." Zimmerman's eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming shallow but less labored, as though he was no longer fighting so hard. "Good," he repeated softly. They sat with him through the night, Beatrice holding one hand, Thomas the other. Near dawn, doctor. Joshua Zimmerman took one final breath and slipped peacefully away, his daughter's head resting against his chest, his hand still clasped in Thomas's strong grip. The funeral was held 2 days later in Silver Creek's small cemetery, attended by many townspeople who had known and respected Dr. Zimmerman during his 2 years there. Thomas stood beside Beatrice throughout the service, his steady presence a comfort as she bid farewell to her father. After the last mourners had departed, they remained by the fresh grave, Thomas's arm around Beatrice's shoulders as she placed a single white rose on the simple wooden marker. "He liked you immediately, you know," she said quietly. "He told me after your first meeting that you were a good man who had lost his way but was finding it again." Thomas smiled sadly. He saw more clearly than most. He tightened his arm around her. "Are you all right?" "I will be," she replied, leaning into his strength. He had a good life, and he wasn't afraid at the end. That's a blessing. They stood in silence for a few minutes more, honoring the man who had, in his final days, brought them together. Finally, Beatrice turned away from the grave, her expression resolute despite her grief. "It's time to fulfill our promise to him," she said. To live well, to seek justice, and to find happiness together. Thomas nodded, taking her hand firmly in his. Where do we start? By making a home, she answered. Not in Clearwater Springs, where there are too many painful memories for you. Not in Silver Creek, where I'll be reminded daily of Father's absence. Somewhere new, where we can build something together while we work on bringing Blackstone to justice. Thomas considered this. Helena, perhaps. It's the territorial capital. We'd have access to records, officials. And it's far enough from Blackstone's immediate influence to be safer. Helena it is, then. Beatrice's smile was tentative but genuine. When do we leave? Tomorrow, Thomas decided. No point in delaying. Your father was right about one thing above all others. Time is precious. The next morning, they departed Silver Creek with their few possessions packed on the horses they'd ridden from Clearwater Springs. The journey to Helena took 4 days, during which they continued to grow closer, planning their future and their strategy for exposing Blackstone's corruption. In Helena, they found lodging at a respectable boarding house while searching for more permanent accommodations. Thomas secured work as a part-time scout for the Territorial Survey Office, using his knowledge of the region to help map new settlements. Beatrice found employment teaching at a newly established school, her Eastern education making her a valuable addition to the frontier town. By day, they lived ordinary lives. By night and on weekends, they worked tirelessly on building their case against Blackstone and the Montana Mining Consortium, writing letters to potential witnesses, researching land records, compiling evidence of fraud and corruption. 3 months after settling in Helena, they were married in a simple ceremony attended by the few friends they'd made in their new home. That evening, in the small house they'd purchased on the outskirts of town, Thomas presented Beatrice with a gift, a silver locket containing a tiny portrait of her father that he'd commissioned from a traveling artist who had passed through Silver Creek. So he's always with you, Thomas explained as she opened it with trembling fingers, watching over us as we build the life he wanted for you. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. He would be proud of us, I think. Of how far we've come in such a short time, Thomas nodded, drawing her into his arms. From a whiskey-soaked former rancher with a grudge to a sober man with purpose and hope. He kissed her gently. All because you had the courage to pour out my whiskey and offer me something better. Their investigation into Blackstone's activities progressed slowly, but steadily over the following months. Through careful research and correspondence, they built a comprehensive case documenting the mining company's pattern of illegal land seizures, false accusations against legitimate landowners, and corruption of local officials. 6 months after their wedding, they finally had enough evidence to present their findings to the territorial governor, a detailed dossier that implicated not only Blackstone but several corrupt officials in Clearwater Springs and surrounding counties. The governor, impressed by their meticulous documentation and concerned about the growing power of mining interests in the territory, ordered a full investigation. Within weeks, warrants were issued for Blackstone and his associates. Thomas and Beatrice were in their garden, planting spring vegetables, when the telegram arrived confirming that Blackstone had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, corruption, and most significantly for Thomas, the wrongful death of Jack Lawson. It's over, Thomas said quietly, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. They've got him. Beatrice wrapped her arms around him, soil-stained hands and all. Justice for Jack, for your land, for all the others he harmed. Thomas nodded, surprising himself with the complex emotions washing through him. There was satisfaction, certainly, but not the vindictive triumph he might once have expected. Instead, he felt a sense of completion, of a chapter closing. What happens now? Beatrice asked, echoing the question she had posed on the Henderson house porch the night they had declared their love. Thomas looked around at their modest home, the garden they were creating together, the life they were building. Now we live, he said simply. We honor your father's wisdom and Jack's memory by living well. The governor's investigation eventually resulted in the return of Thomas's land, the deed to the Lawson ranch restored to its rightful owner. But rather than return to Clearwater Springs, Thomas and Beatrice decided to sell the property, using the proceeds to expand their home in Helena and establish a small foundation in Dr. Zimmerman's name to provide medical care for those who couldn't afford it. A year after their wedding, their family grew with the birth of their first child, a son they named Joshua Jack Lawson, honoring both the father and brother who had shaped their journey together. On the evening after Joshua's birth, as Beatrice rested with their newborn son, Thomas stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in the same fiery colors he'd seen through the window of the Rusty Nail Saloon nearly 2 years earlier. He thought about the man he'd been then broken, bitter, drowning his pain in whiskey, and marveled at the path that had led him here. To a home filled with love and purpose. To a family that gave his life meaning beyond vengeance or grief. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Thomas whispered a silent thank you to Jack and to Dr. Zimmerman for the parts they had played in his journey. And most of all to Beatrice, who had reached for his hand that day in Clearwater Springs and poured his whiskey away, offering him not just sobriety but salvation. Thomas turned from the sunset and went inside, closing the door on the past and stepping fully into the future they were building together, a future founded not on the pain they had survived, but on the love they had found amidst the ashes of their former lives. In the years that followed, Thomas and Beatrice Lawson became respected figures in Helena. Their foundation grew to support not only medical care but education for girls and women throughout the territory. They welcomed 2 more daughters they named Catherine and Elizabeth, and watched with pride as Montana progressed from territory to statehood. Thomas never touched whiskey again, finding in his family and work all the solace he had once sought in alcohol. And Beatrice, true to her promise to her father, lived happily not without challenges or sorrows, but with the deep contentment of a life well lived and well loved. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they returned to Silver Creek to visit Dr. Zimmerman's grave. The town had grown and prospered, the small cemetery now a peaceful park with mature trees shading the graves of the pioneers who had settled there. As they stood hand in hand before her father's marker, Beatrice placed a bouquet of wildflowers beside the stone, now weathered by years of Montana seasons. "He was right," she said softly, "about everything." Thomas nodded, the gray now predominant in his hair but his eyes clear and bright with health and happiness. "He saw the possibility of redemption when I couldn't see it myself, and he saw the possibility of us when we were still strangers." "Not strangers," Beatrice corrected, looking up at the man who had been her partner, her love, her compass for 2 decades. "Just souls who hadn't recognized each other yet." As they walked away from the cemetery, their hands still linked as they had been since that night on the Henderson house porch, Thomas reflected that his journey from despair to hope, from isolation to connection, had begun with a single courageous act, a woman reaching for his hand and pouring away the whiskey he'd been using to drown his pain. In that moment, as he'd watched the amber liquid splashing onto the sawdust-covered floor of the Rusty Nail Saloon, he could never have imagined the life that awaited him. A life not free from sorrow or struggle but rich with purpose and love. A life redeemed. And in the end, that redemption, not vengeance, not justice, but the simple grace of second chances, had been the greatest gift of all.